Months passed, and Sarah's life began to take on a rhythm of its own, a rhythm that was entirely hers. The small apartment she had moved into became more than just a place to live. It became a sanctuary. Every corner reflected her personality, from the vibrant paintings she created during quiet afternoons to the potted plants lining the windowsills, their leaves reaching toward the sunlight. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. What mattered most was that it felt like home, a word she hadn't truly understood until now. Her days were filled with purpose. She took up part-time work at a local cafe, not because she needed the money, but because she enjoyed the simple joy of making someone's day brighter with a warm cup of coffee or a kind word. Her evenings were reserved for herself, cooking meals without worrying about criticism, reading books she had always meant to get around to, and occasionally meeting friends who had become her chosen family. They celebrated milestones together, her first paycheck, her first solo trip to the beach, and reminded her often how proud they were of the strength she had shown. Daniel faded into the background of her life, a distant memory rather than a looming presence. News trickled in occasionally. He had moved to another city, struggled professionally, and lost touch with many mutual acquaintances, but Sarah rarely thought about him anymore. When she did, it was with a sense of detachment, as if recalling a character from a book she had long since finished. The fear he once instilled in her was gone, replaced by an unshakable confidence in her ability to stand on her own. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah decided to visit the park near her apartment. She carried a sketchpad and pencils, eager to capture the golden hues of falling leaves against the clear blue sky. As she sat on a bench, pencil moving steadily across the page, she noticed a young woman nearby struggling with a stroller stuck in the gravel path. Without hesitation, Sarah set down her sketchpad and walked over to help. "Thanks so much," the woman said gratefully after Sarah freed the stroller. "I'm new to this area, and everything feels overwhelming." There was a vulnerability in her voice that resonated deeply with Sarah. She smiled warmly and introduced herself, offering words of encouragement. By the time they parted ways, Sarah realized something important. Helping others gave her a profound sense of fulfillment. It reminded her of how far she had come and how much she could give back. Inspired by the encounter, Sarah began volunteering at a community center, teaching art classes to women rebuilding their lives after difficult experiences. Watching them express themselves through colors and shapes brought her immense joy, and she often stayed late to chat with them, sharing stories and advice. Many of the women looked up to her, seeing in her a reflection of what they hoped to achieve: resilience, independence, and peace. As winter approached, Sarah hosted her first holiday gathering in her tiny apartment. Friends crowded around the table laden with homemade dishes, laughter filling every inch of the space. Someone joked about how different this party was from the disastrous dinner months earlier, and everyone erupted into laughter, including Sarah. This time, there was no tension, no fear, just warmth and connection. For the first time in years, she felt completely at ease, surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was. Later that night, as she cleaned up, Sarah paused to look out the window at the twinkling city lights below. She thought about the journey she had been on, the pain, the courage, the triumphs, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way she had once imagined, but in many ways, it was better. She had faced her darkest moments and emerged stronger, braver, and freer than ever before. Smiling softly to herself, Sarah whispered into the quiet room, "This is just the beginning." And as she turned off the light and headed to bed, she knew she was right. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, not as a victim, not as someone else's shadow, but as the author of her own story. The days following the dinner party felt surreal for Sarah, as though she were living someone else's life. Word of what had happened spread quickly through their social circle, carried by whispers and hushed phone calls. Some people reached out to offer support, while others distanced themselves entirely, unsure how to navigate the fallout. But Sarah didn't dwell on any of it. For the first time in years, Her focus wasn't on pleasing others or maintaining appearances. It was on herself. Daniel, on the other hand, became a pariah almost overnight. Once admired for his charm and success, he now found himself ostracized by the very people who had once flocked to his side. Friends stopped returning his calls, colleagues avoided him at work, and even casual acquaintances gave him wide berth when they crossed paths. The restraining order meant he couldn't come near Sarah or their home, leaving him isolated and humiliated. He tried to defend himself, posting vague justifications online and hinting at misunderstandings, but no one believed him anymore. The mask he had worn for so long had finally slipped, revealing the truth beneath. Sarah, meanwhile, began the process of rebuilding her life. With the help of her lawyer, she secured temporary housing, a small but cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. Boxes filled with her belongings arrived one by one, each unpacked item marking a step toward independence. She decorated sparingly at first, placing photos of happier times on the walls and arranging familiar knickknacks on shelves. Slowly but surely, the space started to feel like home. Her friends rallied around her, offering not just emotional support, but practical help as well. Lisa visited frequently, bringing meals and helping sort through paperwork. Tom called regularly to check in, always ready with a listening ear or a kind word. Even some acquaintances from the dinner party reached out, apologizing for not noticing sooner and vowing to stand by her moving forward. Their gestures reminded Sarah that she wasn't alone, and that she never would be again. But perhaps the most transformative change came from within. For years, Sarah had doubted herself, believing Daniel's cruel words and internalizing his criticisms. Now she worked tirelessly to undo that damage. She started journaling, pouring her thoughts onto paper as a way to process her feelings. She joined a local support group for women who had experienced similar situations, finding solace in shared stories and collective strength. And she rediscovered hobbies she'd abandoned during her marriage: painting, gardening, cooking meals purely for enjoyment rather than perfection. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of her new apartment watching the sunset, Sarah realized something profound. She was free. Free from fear, free from shame, free from the need to constantly prove herself. It wasn't an easy freedom. It came with scars and challenges. But it was hers nonetheless. She smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace wash over her that she hadn't known in years. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I spent so long letting someone else define me. I let his anger shape my worth, his approval dictate my happiness, but no more. This is my life now, and I'm going to build it on my own terms." As she closed the book and set it aside, she felt a spark of excitement for the future, a future where she could be whoever she wanted to be, without fear or apology. Though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, Sarah knew she had everything she needed to face it: courage, resilience, and a community of people who loved and supported her. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt hopeful. The room erupted into a flurry of reactions, each guest grappling with the bombshell Sarah had just dropped. Some sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and eyes wide, while others whispered urgently to one another, their voices low but tinged with shock and disbelief. Lisa dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she'd heard. Tom leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, muttering under his breath, "I can't believe this." Daniel, meanwhile, was visibly unraveling. His earlier attempts to defend himself had fallen flat, and now he stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for words that simply wouldn't come. He glanced around the room, hoping, perhaps even expecting, that someone would jump to his aid, offer some kind of support or justification for his actions. But there was nothing. No nods of agreement, no sympathetic smiles, not even a single person meeting his gaze. One of the male guests, Mark, finally broke the tension. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, his voice rising slightly as he turned to Daniel. You hit her. In front of all of us. What is wrong with you? The question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable. Another guest chimed in, her tone laced with anger. How could you do something like that? And then act like it's no big deal. Daniel stammered, his usual composure completely shattered. It wasn't like that, he insisted weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. She's exaggerating. It's complicated. His excuses sounded hollow, even to his own ears, and the more he spoke, the more desperate he appeared. Sarah watched him quietly, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't interrupt or engage further. Instead, she let the weight of his words, and the glaring lack of credibility behind them, speak for itself. Her silence said more than any rebuttal ever could, and it only deepened the chasm between him and the rest of the room. Lisa finally found her voice, addressing Sarah directly. Why didn't you say something sooner? She asked gently, her concern evident. We're your friends. We could have helped. Sarah gave her a small, sad smile. I wanted to, she admitted, but I was scared. Scared of what he might do, scared of being judged, scared of losing everything. Tonight changed things. Her honesty struck a chord with the group. Several people nodded in understanding, their expressions softening as they realized how much courage it must have taken for her to speak up. One woman reached out and placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. You don't deserve this, she said firmly. No one does. As the murmurs continued, Daniel made one last attempt to salvage the situation. This isn't fair, he protested, his voice rising slightly. You're turning everyone against me. But his words only fueled the growing outrage among the guests. Tom stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. Against you. He shot back, his tone icy. Maybe if you hadn't acted like a monster, we wouldn't be here. The comment drew murmurs of agreement from others. Even those who had initially seemed hesitant to take sides were now openly condemning Daniel's behavior. Someone suggested calling the police, while another offered to drive Sarah wherever she needed to go immediately. The tide had turned completely, leaving Daniel isolated and exposed in the center of the room. Sarah, sensing the escalating tension, raised her hand slightly to calm the group. Thank you all for your support, she said softly. But I've already handled the legal side of things. What I need now is space, to breathe, to think, to start over. Her voice carried a quiet strength, and the guests fell silent once again, moved by her determination. Turning back to the group, she added, Please, don't let this ruin your evening. I'll ask you all to leave, not because I'm ashamed, but because I need time to process everything. You've given me more support tonight than I ever imagined, and for that, I'm grateful. Her words brought a round of nods and murmured farewells as the guests began gathering their belongings, offering hugs and words of encouragement before filing out of the house. As the last guest stepped through the door, Sarah exhaled deeply, feeling both drained and empowered. For the first time in years, she was truly alone, but also freer than she'd ever been. Sarah's revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and undeniable. The room was silent except for the faint sound of her footsteps as she moved to the center of the space, commanding attention without raising her voice. Her earlier hesitation had vanished, replaced by a quiet determination that seemed to grow with each word she spoke. I've spent years covering up what happens behind closed doors, she began, her voice steady now, almost conversational, as if she were sharing a long-held secret with close friends. But tonight, I can't do it anymore. Not here. Not in front of all of you. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of each guest individually. Some looked away, unable to hold her stare, while others leaned forward, hanging on her every word. She took a deep breath before continuing. You see me smiling at these parties, laughing at Daniel's jokes, making sure everything is perfect. What you don't see is what happens after everyone leaves. The insults, the accusations, The way he makes me feel like nothing I do is ever good enough." Daniel shifted uncomfortably where he stood, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of her words. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Sarah raised a hand, silencing him with a look so firm it stopped him in his tracks. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, his usual confidence replaced by an uneasy uncertainty. "And then there are the moments when words aren't enough," she continued, her tone softening slightly but still carrying an unshakable authority. "The times when anger turns physical. Like tonight." She gestured toward her cheek, the red mark still visible despite her efforts to remain composed. "This isn't the first time, though it might be the last." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some guests exchanged horrified glances, while others sat frozen, their expressions a mix of disbelief and sorrow. Lisa covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. Tom clenched his fists beneath the table, his jaw tightening as he processed what she was saying. Daniel tried once more to regain control. "Sarah, please," he pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. "You're exaggerating. It's not like that." "It is like that," she interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through his feeble attempt at denial. "And I'm tired of pretending otherwise. I'm tired of being afraid. Afraid of speaking up, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of you." Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of Daniel's carefully constructed image. The charming host, the successful professional, the devoted husband, all of it crumbled in the face of her truth. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked smaller, diminished in the eyes of those who had once admired him. Sarah paused again, allowing her words to sink in. Then, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, she added, "I've already taken steps to protect myself. Earlier this week, I met with a lawyer. We filed for divorce yesterday." A murmur spread through the room, low and urgent, as the gravity of her statement sank in. "And just this morning," she continued, her voice unwavering, "I secured a restraining order against him, effective immediately." The murmurs grew louder, turning into outright whispers. One guest muttered, "Oh my God," while another whispered urgently to their partner, "Did you know about this?" Daniel stared at Sarah, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He stammered something incoherent, but no one paid him any mind. Sarah turned back to the group, her expression softening further as she addressed them directly. "I didn't plan to share this tonight," she admitted. "But sometimes life forces your hand. I wanted you to hear it from me, not because I owe you an explanation, but because I refuse to let him rewrite the story." Her final words resonated deeply, leaving the room in stunned silence. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her, a quiet understanding that she had finally reclaimed her power. And as she stood there, surrounded by people who could no longer look away, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. For a moment, the room felt like it had been suspended in time. Sarah stood there, her hand still pressed to her cheek, her eyes locked onto Daniel's. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware as someone nervously adjusted their fork. Everyone waited for her to crumble, to shrink away as they assumed she always did. But instead, something inside Sarah shifted. Her breaths came slower now, steadier. She lowered her hand from her face, revealing the red mark that was beginning to darken on her skin. Her lips parted slightly, and though her voice trembled at first, it carried a quiet strength that no one expected. "This," she said softly, almost under her breath, "ends now." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. At first, Daniel smirked, clearly believing this was just another fleeting reaction. He uncrossed his arms and leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, as if he thought she'd retreat into herself any second. "Sarah," he began, his tone condescending, "don't make a scene." But Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her spine, standing taller than anyone had ever seen her before. She turned slowly to face the room full of guests, her gaze sweeping over each stunned face. For years, she had hidden behind smiles and polite excuses, keeping their secrets tucked away where no one could see them. But tonight, that facade cracked wide open. "I've spent years pretending everything is fine," she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I've smiled through insults, apologized when I wasn't wrong, and made excuses for behavior no one should have to endure." Her eyes flickered briefly to Daniel, who was beginning to look uneasy. "But I'm done." The guests exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Some looked horrified, others uncomfortable, but none dared to interrupt. Lisa, the same woman who had whispered earlier, clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her expression a mix of pity and admiration. Tom sat forward, his elbows resting on the table, watching intently as if witnessing something monumental unfold. Daniel tried to regain control of the situation. "Come on, Sarah," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to himself. "You're overreacting. Let's just sit down and enjoy the meal." "No," Sarah cut him off sharply, her voice ringing out like a bell. It was a single word, but it carried so much weight that Daniel actually took a step back. "No more pretending. No more letting you get away with treating me like I don't matter." Her words struck a chord not just with Daniel, but with everyone in the room. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recalling moments when they might have noticed something off about the couple's dynamic but chose to ignore it. Others nodded subtly, silently cheering her on. Sarah paused, taking a deep breath. Her hands were trembling again. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from resolve. "Do you know what it feels like?" she asked, her voice softer now, but no less powerful, "to wake up every day wondering if today will be the day you finally push too far. To feel like your worth is measured by how well you can tiptoe around someone else's temper." The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced around the room, searching for support, but found none. His usual charm and confidence seemed to desert him, leaving him looking smaller somehow. Sarah turned back to her guests, her expression softening. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this," she said sincerely. "But maybe it's better this way. Maybe it's time for the truth to come out." With that, she stepped away from the table, her movements deliberate and calm. She didn't run or cower. She walked with purpose, leaving behind a room full of shocked faces, and one man who suddenly realized he had lost control of the narrative forever. The moment that changed everything happened so quickly that no one in the room had time to react. The guests were settling into their seats, chatting animatedly as they admired the beautifully laid-out table. Sarah stood at the head of the dining area, making a final check to ensure everything was perfect. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a napkin here and straightened a fork there, her movements precise but hurried. Daniel, meanwhile, had been pacing near the table, glancing over the setup with a critical eye. He paused, his gaze landing on the silverware. For a brief second, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, his face darkened. "What is this?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the cheerful hum of conversation like a knife. Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned slowly to see what had caught his attention. It was the placement of the forks. Some were slightly off-center, not perfectly aligned with the edges of the plates. A trivial detail, one that most people wouldn't even notice, but to Daniel, it was apparently unacceptable. "This is a disaster," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Before Sarah could respond or try to explain, he took a step toward her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, she thought he might simply berate her again. But then, in a move that shocked everyone present, he raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and unmistakable. Time seemed to stop. Sarah staggered backward, her hand instinctively flying to her stinging cheek. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she just stood there, frozen in disbelief, staring at him as if trying to process what had just happened. For the guests, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. Conversations halted mid-sentence, forks clattered onto plates, and chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some gasped audibly, while others sat in stunned silence, their mouths agape. No one moved. No one spoke. The once warm atmosphere turned icy, heavy with tension and disbelief. Daniel, for his part, seemed momentarily satisfied. He glanced around the room, perhaps expecting someone to agree with him or validate his actions. When no one did, his confidence faltered slightly, though he still wore an air of defiance. He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening as if daring anyone to challenge him. One of the female guests, Lisa, broke the silence first, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Did that really just happen? She murmured to the person next to her. Another guest, Tom, leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed in confusion and anger. Is he serious right now? He muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Despite the chaos swirling around them, all eyes remained fixed on Sarah. Everyone waited to see how she would react. Would she burst into tears? Retreat to another room in embarrassment? Or worse, would she apologize, as if she deserved what had just happened? But Sarah didn't do any of those things. She stood rooted to the spot, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. Her fingers pressed against her reddened cheek, but her expression began to shift. The initial shock gave way to something else, something stronger. As the seconds ticked by, the room grew quieter, anticipation building like a storm about to break. And then, in a voice so calm it sent chills down everyone's spines, Sarah spoke. As the evening unfolded, the initial charm of the dinner party began to wear thin. For Sarah, at least, while the guests mingled and laughed in the living room, she remained in the background, darting between the kitchen and dining area to ensure everything was in place. Each trip gave her a momentary reprieve from Daniel's watchful eyes, but it wasn't enough to ease the growing unease inside her. The first disagreement came when Daniel inspected the seating arrangement. "Why is Mark sitting here?" he asked, pointing to one of the place cards. His tone was light, almost teasing, but Sarah recognized the edge beneath it. She glanced at him, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought it would be nice to mix things up," she explained. "You know, let people meet new faces." Daniel frowned, tapping the card with his finger. "It doesn't make sense," he said dismissively. "Switch them." Without waiting for her response, he rearranged two of the cards himself, muttering something about how these events required precision. Sarah bit her lip, forcing herself not to argue. Instead, she nodded and moved on, pretending the exchange hadn't rattled her. Moments later, another issue arose. This time, it was the centerpiece, a vase of fresh flowers Sarah had picked out earlier that day. Daniel tilted his head as he studied it, then turned to her with raised eyebrows. "Are you sure this is the best choice? It looks messy." "Messy?" Sarah blinked, taken aback. The arrangement had been carefully curated, vibrant blooms spilling over the edges in an elegant cascade. To her, it looked beautiful. But before she could defend her decision, Daniel reached across the table and adjusted the flowers himself, leaving them stiff and overly symmetrical. Sarah clenched her fists briefly, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to say something, to remind him that this was supposed to be her night too. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she forced a tight smile and walked back to the kitchen, telling herself to focus on what mattered, getting through the evening without incident. Unfortunately, the tension only escalated. When the appetizers were served, Daniel criticized the portion sizes, claiming they weren't generous enough for their guests. Then, during the main course, he complained about the seasoning on the chicken, saying it lacked flavor. Each comment was delivered casually, often accompanied by a laugh or a shrug, as if he were merely joking around. But Sarah knew better. Every remark chipped away at her confidence, making her feel smaller and more invisible with each passing minute. Their guests, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the brewing storm. They complimented the food, praised the ambience, and marveled at how smoothly everything was running. What they didn't see, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the way Sarah flinched whenever Daniel spoke, the way her shoulders tensed whenever he approached. Occasionally, someone might glance at her with mild concern, noticing the faint lines of strain around her eyes. But no one said anything, assuming it was just pre-party nerves. By the time dessert was ready, Sarah felt like she was walking on eggshells. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, imagining all the ways Daniel might find fault next. She double-checked every detail, triple-counted the spoons, and even rehearsed her responses to potential complaints. Still, despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that something was bound to go wrong. And when it did, there would be no hiding it from their guests. Unbeknownst to everyone else, this wasn't the first time Sarah had endured such treatment. Over the years, Daniel's criticisms had become a constant presence in their marriage, eroding her self-esteem piece by piece. Tonight, however, felt different. With so many eyes watching, the stakes felt higher than ever. And as the final touches were put on the table, Sarah braced herself for whatever might come next, praying she could hold it together long enough to get through the night. The evening began like any other dinner party at Sarah and Daniel's house, with a faint hum of conversation drifting through the air. Their home was always a picture of elegance, spotless marble countertops, tasteful decorations, and soft lighting that created an inviting atmosphere. Tonight, however, there was an unspoken tension lingering beneath the surface, something almost imperceptible to their guests, but palpable enough for those paying close attention. Sarah moved briskly around the kitchen, her hands deftly arranging plates of food while keeping one eye on the clock. She had spent hours preparing everything. The roasted chicken glazed to perfection, the fresh salad tossed with just the right amount of dressing, and the dessert, a rich chocolate cake she knew everyone would rave about. Despite her efforts, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the food or the setup, it was Daniel. He stood in the living room, laughing loudly as he recounted a work story to their friends. His confidence filled the room, drawing people in effortlessly. To anyone watching, Daniel seemed charming, successful, and completely at ease. But Sarah knew better. Over the years, she'd learned to read the subtle signs, the way his smile tightened when things didn't go exactly as planned, the sharp edge in his voice when he thought no one else could hear. Tonight, those signs were more pronounced than usual. As the first wave of guests arrived, Sarah greeted them warmly, masking her unease behind polite smiles and cheerful small talk. Inside, though, her mind raced. Had she forgotten anything? Was the table set correctly? Would Daniel find fault with something again? These questions looped endlessly in her head, each one tightening the knot in her stomach. Still, she pushed forward, determined not to let her anxiety show. Meanwhile, Daniel played the role of the perfect host, making sure everyone felt welcome. He complimented the women on their outfits and joked with the men about weekend plans. Yet every so often, his gaze would drift toward the dining area where Sarah worked tirelessly. Once, he called out to her, asking if she needed help. When she declined politely, he shrugged and turned back to his guests, dismissing the moment without a second thought. But Sarah noticed. She always did. There was something in his tone, a mix of impatience and condescension, that made her pause mid-task. For a brief moment, she considered stepping away, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Instead, she forced a smile and continued setting the table, carefully placing forks and knives in their proper positions. Everything had to be perfect tonight. Anything less, and she feared what might happen later. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. The golden glow of the chandelier reflected off the polished silverware, creating a scene straight out of a magazine. To the casual observer, it looked like the ideal evening among friends. But as the minutes ticked by, The undercurrent of tension grew stronger, hinting at the storm brewing beneath the surface. Little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary dinner party was about to take a turn none of them would ever forget.